özellikle sosyal duygusal gelişim ve ahlak gelişim konusunda öncü isimlerden biri. Günümüzde en güncel ahlak gelişimine çalışan isimlerden biri Eliot Turel. Çok iyi bir araştırmacı. O yüzden bizim için çok büyük mutluluk bugün aramızda olması. Ben öncelikle kendisine çok teşekkür ediyorum. Buraya geldiği için, bizimle olduğu için ve bir alkış istiyorum tabii ki. Eliot Turel bizim ülkemize çok yakın bir adada, Rodos Adası'nda dünyaya gelmiş bir isim. Belki Google'ladığınızda ismini pek çoğunuz okumuştur. Annesi İzmirli, babası Rodoslu, orada büyüyor 8 yaşına kadar. Daha sonra İkinci Dünya Savaşı sırasında İzmir'e geliyorlar. Bir süre İzmir'de kaldıktan sonra Amerika'ya göç ediyorlar. Yale psikolojiyi bitirerek de kendisi akademik kariyerine devam ediyor. Pek çok araştırmacı yetiştiriyor. Hala daha güncel olarak kendisi Berkeley'de, University of Berkeley'de dersler veriyor. Hatta bugün 2 öğrencisi de aramızda bizlerle beraber, 2 Türk öğrencisi buradan Berkeley'e gidip kendisinin doktora öğrencisi olma şansına erişmişler. Bugün de kendileri aramızda. Onlara da teşekkür ediyoruz geldikleri için. Ben daha fazla sözü uzatmayayım. Heyecandan zaten şu anda ne dediğimi çok farkında değilim. Ben Eliot'u sahneye davet etmek istiyorum ve geldiği için çok çok teşekkür ediyorum yürekten.
First, I will take my jacket off. It's warm here. And second, I want to thank you for that very nice introduction, and thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to talk to you today. This has been, so far, has been a very interesting, stimulating Congress, and I'm very glad to be back in Turkey, where I have many connections and memories. And as you just heard, I was born in Rhodos, the Greek island not far from here. And my mother, the connection to Turkey. The connection to, well, before I go on, I have to thank these people because they rescued me this morning from a terrible fate, which was that the slides were not working. And what could be worse than finding yourself with slides that don't work? And they did a great job of fixing it for me. Thank you. So as I was saying, my mother was from Izmir, and we lived in Izmir for 2 years before moving to New York City. But I've come back many times to Turkey to visit, but I even did some research on moral development a long time ago, many years ago, in a village near the city of Manisa, which is close to Izmir. But I'm not going to talk about that research today. I will talk about the development of morality, as you can see from my title. And that title is meant to convey 3 main issues that I'll be discussing today. I'll talk about moral and social development with an emphasis on judgments, an emphasis on reasoning. And that research is based on a theoretical framework in which it is proposed that children construct, and I emphasize the word construct ways of thinking that involve concerns with moral issues regarding people's welfare, regarding justice and fairness, and regarding rights. And that framework, as you heard, has been labeled social domain theory. And the theory of research formed a grounding for other research on how moral decisions are made through what we refer to as coordination in decision making. I'll discuss, in addition, I'll discuss research on cultural practices and orientations. And that research has focused on what I call social opposition and moral resistance. And this is moral resistance to perceived injustices and inequalities within cultures. And the research on resistance was done mostly in patriarchal cultures. There you can see a definition. These are cultures in which there's male dominance over females. And the research has shown that females are critical of social inequalities within cultures, critical of male dominance, but more, I won't say any more about that now, more later. Now, I should say that I'm a psychologist, a developmental psychologist, so I do not approach questions about culture from an anthropological perspective. Of course, that's a common perspective on issues of culture, but I do so from a psychological perspective. Whether it is a psychological or an anthropological perspective, associations that are made of culture to morality raise important questions as to whether morality is specific to different cultures or if morality applies across cultures. And there are lots of I'll get back to that slide I just skipped over. These are important questions over which there's a good deal of controversy, and the questions are whether moral values are different from one culture to another so that they cannot be compared with each other, or are there moral judgments, forms of moral reasoning, am I right or wrong, regarding ways to treat people that are not restricted to particular cultures, but cut across cultures. And answers to these questions are closely related to explanations of how morality develops in individuals. The approach I take leads to the conclusion, and it's supported, I think, by a good deal of research evidence, that morality can be applied across cultures, that it's relevant across most cultures in the world. But, as you probably know, in psychology and in anthropology as well, there are different explanations regarding the development of morality. Some have taken a relativistic position, meaning that morality is relative to specific cultures and be different from one culture to another. They've done so by proposing that children are taught and come to learn the moral values of their culture. And usually, these are learned from parents or other adults. And in these explanations, children must be taught to give up some of their self-interest, some of their needs, and incorporate their cultural values, internalize the cultural values. In classic work, Sigmund Freud and others took this approach. In their explanations, there's a good deal of conflict in the process because of what they thought were strong instincts and needs. In behaviorist explanations, also classic explanations in psychology, learning of values occurs through rewards and punishments or through children imitating others. And B.F. Skinner was a prominent American behaviorist. In current times, this has been extended in what is referred to as labeled social learning theory. with an emphasis on imitation and child rearing practices, seem to result in moral development. One other approach of this type, which is a more contemporary approach, comes from those who think that children come to identify with a general cultural orientation to morality and to the group, and they label themselves cultural psychologists. And here are some references to those cultural psychologists. In this case, it's proposed that cultures are cohesive, harmonious, and integrated, and that they can have different moral and social orientations from each other. Often it's proposed that cultures can be divided by orientations to either individualism or collectivism. And these are orientations that are usually associated with Western cultures, which are said to be individualistic, or non-Western cultures, which are said to be collectivistic. And generally, I think Turkey would be considered a non-Western collectivistic culture. And the general idea is that individualistic cultures give more importance to the individual. In those cultures, people have freedoms of choice, and I've listed some of the characteristics that are attributed to each type. In those cultures, people have freedoms of choice and value independence, and morality is based on rights. In collectivistic cultures, most important is said to be given to the group. People accept the roles that are given by society, and morality is based on duties and following rules, and rather than rights. And in these explanations, morality is often seen as relativistic, that is, that it differs by culture. And so these are the some of the main approaches to the idea that moral development occurs through direct teaching from adults or via cultural practices, and that children acquire these values or norms. I want to briefly mention one other approach that has received much attention in the United States, and maybe here too. I'd be interested in knowing if that's the case. It's an approach that emphasizes biology. And these researchers use neuroscience to study moral decisions by presenting people with two versions of what are referred to as trolley car dilemmas or situations, while the people being asked these questions are in an fMRI machine. And in one version of these trolley car situations, the way it's described is that a trolley car is heading towards 5 people. A runaway trolley car is heading towards 5 people who will be killed unless a bystander pulls a switch that will cause the trolley car to go onto another track, and it will instead kill 1 person instead of 5. In a second version, a bystander can save the 5 by pushing a man who's standing on a bridge, and that man would die, but it would divert the trolley car, and the 5 people would be saved. So you can see in both of these situations, it's 5 lives versus 1. It's usually found that most say it is all right to pull the switch, as in the first story, but most say it's not all right to push the person, as in the second story. And a main interpretation of the findings that we see in the literature is that moral decisions are biologically determined and based on emotions, which are biologically determined. And so I want to I wanted to tell you about that as an additional position that is based on biology. But I will mention that there are several problems in that interpretation and in the use of, and in the very use of trolley car dilemmas to study moral judgments. And I don't have time to go into any detail on this. We have actually published a monograph that goes into a lot of those problems. But I want to mention one set of important problems, which is that the trolley car situations pose especially difficult moral conflicts that are not representative of the types of moral situations people face in their own lives. These are very difficult and complex moral conflicts because they involve situations in which a strongly held value, the value of life, must be violated in order to maintain the same value. In other words, to save lives, you have to take a life. And this is not a good way to study moral development and moral decisions. And it's not very well representative of the kinds of moral situations that people encounter. In our research, we have used instead situations that are better representative of ones that people actually face in their lives, and especially children. I'll tell you what we have found shortly. But first, there's a question of definition here, and I want to note that that there are connections between our work and philosophical formulations that have been presented over a long time. And our view, as I said at the start, is that morality centrally involves judgment and reasoning, though connected to emotions. And these are judgments about welfare, justice, and rights, as I said. And in this regard, our psychological research has been informed by moral philosophical analysis that do emphasize reasoning. And the work of John Rawls, who wrote a very influential book titled Theory of Justice, is foundational in these things of philosophy. And a long philosophical tradition of this type was well captured by Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, two prominent contemporary philosophers. And Nussbaum stated, and I quote, human beings are above all reasoning beings, and the dignity of reason is the primary source of human equality. And Sen connected reasoning to choice, and he wrote, central to leading a human life are the responsibilities of choice and reasoning. And in stating that humans reason and make choices, they're not excluding emotions. That should be clear. But reasoning is very important. And they were stating that judgments and behaviors, however, are not simply determined by emotions. And of course, Nussbaum and Sen had much more to say than these short statements that I quoted, such as in these important books. Our research, turning to psychology, has been influenced greatly by the theories of Jean Piaget, who was a prominent Swiss psychologist that I assume many of you are familiar with. And in Piaget's perspective, children think about their experiences and work to understand the world around them, including understanding social relationships, social experiences, and these are social experiences with parents and adults and teachers, but also, very importantly, with other children. Now, Piaget, as you may know, mostly studied non-social cognitive development. In his early work, he did one set of studies on moral judgment, which I won't go into. But my colleagues and I have conducted, following up with this approach, have conducted many studies on moral and social judgments using situations that are applicable to everyday life and not situations like the trolley car dilemma. And we have found that in all the cultures we have studied, that by an early age, 4 or 5 or 6 years of age, and maybe a little younger, children form judgments about right and wrong in the moral sense, with understandings of fairness and the need to avoid harming people and the importance of helping others. So morality is not, in our view, is not the incorporation of values in the culture or norms in the culture, but rather it involves substantive understandings of issues like welfare, harm, justice, and rights. And social judgments, such moral judgments pertain to issues like, to give you some examples, hitting, stealing, inequalities, unfair treatment, helping people, sharing or not sharing. Also, the research has shown that young children display positive emotions that are part of their moral judgments, and these are emotions like sympathy, empathy, and affection, not negative emotions. The research also shows that from a young age, children's moral judgments are different from their judgments about other types of rules in families and schools, rules about the customs and conventions in society. Conventions, unlike morality, have to do with keeping things running smoothly, such as how to address people, table manners, raising school hands in a classroom, matters of that sort. And I refer to these as domains because, as a reason for this, it's because children's thinking about morality is different in systematic ways from their thinking about social conventions and the conventions of society. To give you an example, children judge conventions to be legitimately different from one social setting to another, such as the home, the school, or in different cultures. And conventions are dependent on rules and what authorities dictate. But morality is not necessarily tied to rules or authority, and morality is judged, starting at very young ages, to apply across groups and across cultures. And to give you an example of what I'm referring to, if children are posed with questions like, which is some of what we've done in our research, questions like, suppose that an authority in the school, such as a principal, stated that it's all right to hit people. There would be no rules against that. They are asked, would that be all right, and to discuss why it would or would not be all right. And we found that children as young as 4 or 5 years say that it would not be all right, even if there's a rule in the school, even if an authority says it's all right. So here's a quick example from one of our studies in which we ask these kinds of questions, and this as to whether it would be okay to hit if it was accepted in the school. He said, no, it's not okay. And then he was asked, why is it okay? And he said, it's like making other people unhappy. You can hurt in that way. It hurts other people. Hurting is not good. So the judgment is about hurt, not about what an authority says. When it comes to conventions, they accept the role of the authority. They make that distinction. So again, this emphasis on harm at young ages is very important to moral development. And here's just a summary of the features that are associated with morality and convention. And one other domain that we have studied, we labeled the personal domain, and the choice of friends, occupations, which you can't see at the bottom. But what this domain refers to is that children form judgments about autonomy, independence, and personal choices. aspects of life that judge to be up to individuals to decide upon, as long as they don't harm others. And by the way, I'll say more about this later, this kind of concern with the personal, with individual choice, with autonomy, you find in so-called collectivistic cultures, Turkey too, which is in contrast with the idea that in collectivistic cultures, people are not concerned with personal choices. Let me also mention one other thing, which is that the distinction among these domains is not related to age. It's not a developmental process. That is to say that we found that across ages, these distinctions are made, and there are developmental changes that occur, but within each domain. Now, I think there's a question that stems from some of what I've said that needs to be raised, and that might have actually occurred to you as well. It's the following. Earlier I said that the development of moral and social judgments comes about from children's social experiences. And the question would be, if children form their moral judgments through social experiences, how can it be that children growing up in different cultures form similar moral judgments? Because there may be differences between or among these cultures. And there's an answer. The answer is that such judgments are formed out of children's everyday experiences having to do with harm, with benefits to people, with fairness, with equality, and the resolution of conflicts. Experiences like children hitting each other, avoiding hitting each other, helping each other, and so on. These are everyday experiences for children that occur I would argue, in any culture. And I won't go very much into this developmental question, except to illustrate what I mean with a video of a 3-year-old boy and his younger brother, which some of you may be familiar with, but I think it illustrates the point well. It was, this is Charlie Pitney, taken by their parents.
Charlie bit me.
Well, I think you can see that there are mixed emotions here, and especially that children experience these kinds of things, and that these experiences are likely to occur the world over. This is a particularly interesting and catchy example, but it's part of children's lives, and they're not restricted to cultures, I would argue. Right? They're going to be seen everywhere, and these kinds of experiences are important to the development of moral judgments, and they're important because children think about these occurrences. And there's evidence supporting these propositions from research we've done, including observational studies, and studies that ask children to discuss times that they felt hurt by someone and times that they had hurt somebody else. So this is just some references. Again, some of this is cut off because of the difficulties we have with these slides. But if you're interested in any of these references, I can make them available to you. These are references to studies that have been done on these kinds of social experiences and social interactions. But what's important here is that children reflect upon these experiences. And there are studies that have asked children to discuss times that they felt hurt by someone and times that they had hurt somebody in their recent experience. And most could easily talk about such events. And I'll illustrate this with some examples to indicate what was found. Here is what a 7-year-old girl said about a time that she felt ignored. So she was being asked, are there times when you felt harmed by somebody? And this was a time when she had felt that she was hurt because she was ignored by a girl who she thought was her best friend. And but the other girl had referred to another girl as her best friend. She was unhappy about this, and here's what she said. And I kind of thought to myself, that was kind of making me feel bad. So I wonder if I can go over there and tell her that that kind of hurt my feelings. She's a best friend of mine, and I just can't get it out of my mind, because whenever I walked home from her house at night time, she would always give me a hug, and I would always do that, and I would never want to leave her house. And then at the birthday party, I'm wondering if she's really her best friend. And you can see, I think, that this very young person, a 7-year-old, is aware of the emotions involved, and aware of the nature of these relationships, and aware of social conflicts. She's reflecting on them. And here's another example, this time an adolescent, 15-year-old girl, who talked about a time she had tried to avoid spending time with one of her best friends and instead spent time with another friend. So this was an example of an adolescent talking about when she thought she had hurt somebody else's feelings. And here is what she said. And then I was thinking about it, and I was like, how could I do that to my former best friend? Because she was a person too, and just because I wanted to fit in with other people, I shouldn't have done that. And after that, I apologized to her, and she accepted my apology, although I don't think I would have if someone would have done that to me. I would have been really hurt, and I found out that she cried all the time, and that just made me feel really bad that I did that. So ever since then, I don't make fun of people anymore. Okay? These examples, these are examples, but they're supported by our research findings, I want to emphasize. But I give you these examples to show that children and adolescents think about their social relationships and what they should do or should not do. They reflect upon their experiences. So again, these kinds of experiences and reflections upon experiences are sources of the development of moral judgment, is the proposition. Now, there's a second question. So that was, I addressed the question that might be raised in your mind, that I thought should be raised as to how it could be that there are cultures are different in many ways, and yet across cultures we get the same kinds of moral judgments. There's a second question that I should also address, and that maybe not occurred to you. It's a question that bears on what I referred to earlier as processes of coordination. I'll get into that a little bit. It's a question about the proposition that moral judgments are not based on authority dictates or authority instructions, such as in what that 5-year-old said, if you recall. And the question would be, is the idea that moral judgments are not based on what authorities dictate, is that not contradicted by the evidence from the well-known experiments by Stanley Milgram on obedience to authority? Now, I imagine many, maybe most of you are familiar with those experiments. They're in all the psychology textbooks, of course, but they're part, at least in the United States, they're part of general knowledge. But I will briefly summarize those experiments for those who might not be familiar with them. And in these experiments, participants were told to administer increasing levels of electric shocks to another person, who they were led to believe was another participant in the study. He was not. He was a confederate of the experimenters. They were also told that they were taking part in a study on the effects of punishment on learning and memory. And the real participants, not the confederates of the experimenters, were instructed to administer increasing electric shocks to the other person who was told that they were told he was the learner every time he made a mistake. So there's a back and forth between the two, some words they have to learn. If there's a mistake, you're supposed to shock the person. Now, actually, the other person, as you may imagine, did not receive such shocks, but rather he acted as if he were in a lot of pain. Now, Milgram studies are often taken to show that people will obey authority, even when commanded to inflict pain and harm on other people. And that's the case in Milgram's book title, Obedience to Authority. That's the way it's usually presented. Such an interpretation, I think, is not correct. It's a simplification, and keep in mind the question of whether these experiments contradict what I was saying about morality not based on authority instructions or dictates. I think that interpretation that it's obedience to authority is a simplification of what went on in these experiments for two reasons. One reason is that it doesn't account for most of the findings, most of Milgram's findings, most of his findings in several experimental conditions. In most experimental conditions, the large majority refused to go along with the experimenter, with the authority. As you can see in this chart, the conditions, I won't go into all the details, but the conditions varied. The place and role of the experimenter, or the closeness of the person being shocked to the participant. It was only in one condition that the majority went along with the experimenter to the very end of the shocks. As you can see, in most, it was a minority at best, and in some, very few did so. So that suggests that it's more complicated than obedience to authority. In that one condition, it's about 65%. But even the decisions on the part of those who continued shocking to the very end do not simply reflect obedience to authority. Rather, there is a great deal of conflict and concern and process involved on the part of those participants who were shocking the victim. And I think you can clearly see that in a video of one of the participants from Milgram's experiments. This is part of a long film he made that took a little chunk of one participant to show you what was going on. And I think it's quite typical of what went on in the experiments. This takes up in the middle.
Sharp. Axe, needle, stick, blade. Wrong. Please continue. Neil, you're gonna get a shot under the boat. Stand up. I'm not. Continue. I'm up to 3 minutes. Continue. Nice and bold. Dollar necklace. Moon paint. Something happened to that hand. Better check it out.
That's the end of the clip. And this is someone who went all to the very end of the system of shocking. But I hope that it gives you a sense of what was going on. That there's a lot of conflict on his part. It involved concerns with the pain experienced by the other person. They weren't just doing it easily. And obedience, the idea of obedience to authority, doesn't capture his reaction. He was very anxious about the other person's pain, and he often protested to the experimenter. But at the same time, he was concerned with something else. He was concerned with the goals of this scientific enterprise that he was participating in. We see, and what I think we see is that he's trying to weigh and balance those two concerns, the two goals. And that's what I mean by coordination, which I mentioned earlier. Decisions in many social situations require this kind of coordination because most social situations will include more than one consideration. There can be conflicts between moral and non-moral goals, and conflicts between different moral goals. And in the milk group experiments, there was a conflict between the goal of not harming another and a concern with the scientific, continuing to further the scientific goals of the experiment. And in fact, Milgram himself made decisions that involved coordination. And what I mean by that is that he made decisions coordinating his concerns between furthering the scientific goals of his studies and the value of honesty. And I say that because he actually acted dishonestly when he, first of all, recruited participants. Here, I don't know if you can see that, but it's one of the ways he recruited participants. In doing so, he told them that it was a study on learning and memory and was essentially not being honest. He was deceiving these people. And during the experiment itself, they were deceiving people. And so there's that kind of weighing and balancing, which I think in coordination going on when these kinds of experiments are happening. And there were a lot of experiments that went in this direction until people started to institute review boards. And this kind of experiment would be able to be done now in most countries. But let me just mention that honesty with regard to weighing and balancing and coordination is an interesting example, and it often involves coordination and decision making. Honesty is something, it's a value, you could call it, that we tend to think should always be upheld. But if you ask most people, they would say, most of us would say, yes, honesty is important, and you should always be honest. But from a moral point of view, it's not clear that that's the case. For example, in asking, should one always be honest, there's an example that's been analyzed and discussed in philosophy, and the question has been posed in the following way. Should you tell the truth if you know it would result in a murderer killing his victim? And the way they set it up is that somebody runs past you and is running away, and somebody else comes along who you know is out to kill that person, and he asks you, where did he go? What's the moral decision there? Is it to be honest? Well, if you're honest, he's going to know where that person is and go and kill him. And most people would judge that it's morally correct to lie, to be dishonest in this case. So there are conflicts of this sort between honesty and statement of life. Using, and again, I'm going to use this as an example. That's in philosophical discussions. I use that as an example to illustrate the point. But using other issues, we've done a series of studies on judgments about honesty and deception with children, adolescents, and adults. And we found that in coming to decisions, they do weigh and balance the value of honesty with other moral considerations, and sometimes judge that it's necessary to lie in order to further a more important moral goal, as in this example. And such coordination occurs because many situations involve more than one consideration, more than one concern, more than one goal. People perceive these different concerns and goals and have to relate them to each other and make decisions about which is more important. And a number of studies on other moral issues have shown that individuals do engage in such coordination. And one example is research on decisions about rights. The idea of rights and associated freedoms is important to morality, as has been much discussed by philosophers going back to John Stuart Mill. The idea of rights is also important in discussions of morality and culture, because some have claimed that rights, as I said earlier, are only part of Western cultures and not relevant to non-Western societies. And this goes back to the individualism, collectivism distinction. But research in Western and non-Western societies does not support this difference between cultures. Research that's been conducted in the United States, Canada, the Middle East, other countries, countries in Africa, and work in China. So that gives you the features of individualism, collectivism, and some references to the work on rights. And the research shows that rights are part of moral thinking in all these cultures, and that many decisions involve processes of coordination, weighing and balancing different concerns. And in some situations, people will not support rights when they are in conflict with other goals. So there's evidence that ideas about rights and freedom exist in non-Western cultures, yet restrictions on rights and freedoms are often placed on certain groups and many systems that involve social hierarchy. So this raises the issue of unequal treatment of different groups within societies, and brings me to the work that we've done on moral resistance and social opposition, which has to do with patriarchal cultures where some people, some groups are subject to inequalities. And one of the questions in that regard is whether people in patriarchal cultures where there's a social hierarchy that puts males in dominant positions and females in subordinate positions, whether people apply their judgments of fairness to those conditions, or if they accept them because of the collective nature of the society. And we've done several studies in patriarchal cultures to address this kind of question, including whether people in positions of inequality engage in moral resistance. And just to give you the definition of patriarchal cultures again. Our research took place in several settings in the Middle East, India, Colombia, and Benin. Given the time, I'm skipping a couple of things, but here are some references to research in those places. And similar research has been done in Turkey as well in the last of a study done in Turkey. And in our research, we examined the judgments of adolescents and adults about cultural practices of male-female inequalities, that is patriarchy. So inequalities regarding education, work, access to leisure activities, and as to who gets to make decisions within families. And we expect, I won't go into the details of our methodology, but we expected to find that females would not simply accept practices of inequality. They would not just accept their roles because that's what's given in their culture. And that both males and females would be concerned with individual autonomy and freedoms, which would be a source of conflict. So first, we did find that concerns with autonomy and freedoms are part of these cultures, these non-Western patriarchal cultures, which would usually be seen in the individual collectivism economy as collectivism. And in particular, it's recognized that males are granted freedoms, and that males do assert their right to personal choices over females. And females are very aware of this, and in some ways accept their roles, but they often do so because they fear the consequences of defiance, which can be severe in these situations. Still, females want more freedom and greater equality, which they think is not easy to achieve, and as requiring struggles for change. I'll skip that example given the time. But a very significant finding, I think, was that the large majority of females, over 80%, judged the practices of patriarchy and inequality to be unfair and wanted them to be changed. Okay? So to illustrate that, I'm going to give you an example of what an adult female said. She said, a man's life is simple. He works, he comes back home, he has no other responsibilities. I work too, and I have kids and a home. He knows that when he comes back, everything will be ready for him. That's such a pleasure. When I come home, I have more work to do at home. So who do you think deserves to get out of the middle and enjoy life? And I think you can see in that example her sense of grievance and unfairness about this. Now, our studies, just been referred to, mainly looked at judgments. Other studies, ethnographic studies, have been done by anthropologists, which also show that women in these situations act on their judgments of unfairness about patriarchy. Studies done by Wicken and Abu Lughal. Wicken did her research in areas of poverty in Cairo, and Abu Lughal did her research in a Bedouin community in rural areas of Egypt. And both of them found that in daily lives, women often sought ways to avoid control by men, and this is especially adult women, avoiding control by men, and resisting unfair practices, which can bring a lot of conflict for them with it, including conflicts with those in higher economic classes and with governmental authorities. And here's an example of comments made by a woman from Cairo in Wicken studies that are very similar to the comments of the Druze woman that I just showed you. She said, I tried to make Mustafa understand that we must be open with each other and mutually adjust, that we must tell each other what each of us liked and wanted from life so we could make each other happy, but he just scowled and said, I do as I please, I am free. Again, the theme of freedom and autonomy in these cultures. Of course, the man should have his freedom, but not at the woman's expense. Again, you see the same kind of concern as in the other example. And from her research, from Abu Lughal's research with the Bedouin community, which also looked at women's daily activities, it was found that women often try to avoid control by men using various strategies to get around restrictions and inequalities, and to avoid practices like arranged marriages and polygamy, practices that they often judge to be unfair. And that was expressed by one woman in our Beluga study as follows. And this business of marrying more than one wife, I wish they changed their views on this. It is the biggest sin. The prophet is not forbidden, but the prophet said only if you treat her fairly. But a man can't, it can't be done. Even if he has money, he can't. As a person, his thoughts and his actions, he can't be fair. He'll like one more than the other. So this again illustrates the theme of a concern with fairness and unfairness in these cultural practices. And as I hope is clear, these findings of what I call opposition and resistance are in contradiction with the idea that these are so-called collectivistic cultures, at least as they've been described. But I'm running out of time, so I'll conclude quickly if I can. And in concluding, I want to tell you about an example that illustrates, I believe, the importance of moral resistance. And what I've been talking about is moral resistance in everyday activities. And in this case, on the part of females in patriarchal cultures. But the example I want to tell you about in concluding involves a Turkish individual, and it's an event that had an effect on my life and that of my family. As you may know, during World War II, several Turkish diplomats in many countries saved people from German concentration camps. And there's a very interesting book about several of them. But among them was a young Turkish consul named Selahattin Okerman, who was situated in Rhodes. In Rhodes, my birthplace. Here he is. So he was the ambassador at the time. And I should mention, by the way, that Turkey was neutral in World War II, so that's a fact. Well, to make a long story short, he took great risks using various means of persuasion and argumentation and deception with German authorities in order to save a number of people with Turkish citizenship from deportation to Nazi concentration camps. And I won't go into, don't have time to go into details, but he was quite courageous about this and took many risks for his own safety. And he ended up saving 42 people in all, including my own family. That's a great debt to Turkey. And again, I want to emphasize that as important as he was for us, he was not the only one among the Turkish ambassadors. So, I think these types of actions of resistance are consistent with the research findings on social opposition and resistance that I discussed. And so in some ways, there can be more commonalities between people in different cultures in similar positions on the social hierarchy than between people in different positions in the social hierarchy within a culture. That's all to say, I think too often cultural comparisons are much too simple. And all this relates to the main situations in ways that involve coordination. And again, moral judgments are not culturally specific, but can be seen universally. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions. Do we?
Yeah.
Yeah?
We have
some time.
Okay. In that case, I will have to put this on before anybody asks a question in Turkish.
Okay. Thank you, Eliot.
Felsefe çalışmaları yapıyorum. Çocuklarla bir takım hani ahlaki kavramlar üstüne tartışma ve onlara bir takım felsefi eğitimler verme denemesi içerisindeyim. Şöyle bir şey gözlemledim. O gözlemimle ilgili size bir soru sormak istiyorum. Şimdi çocukların ilk yani 10-11 yaşındaki çocuk ilk benim yanıma geldiğinde, ilk eğitimimize başladığımızda tabii ki ahlaki kavramlar üstüne yeterli derecede düşünemediklerini görüyorum. Mesela çocuğa şunu soruyorum. Önünüzde yürüyen birisi parasını düşürdüğünde o parayı alıp ne yaparsınız? Tabii çocuk doğal olarak veririm diyor. Parayı vereceğini söylüyor. Daha sonra ona bunu neden vereceğini soruyorum. Çocuk tabii doğal olarak para onun olduğu için diyor. Ve ondan sonra peki iyi olan davranış sence hangisi? Vermek mi vermemek mi diyorum. Çocuk tabii ki iyi olan davranış vermek diyor. Ama şimdi bu aşamada ahlaki olanı bırakıp tam felsefi bir soru soruyorum. Yani etik olana ilişkin bir soru soruyorum. İyi olmasını neye dayandırıyorsun diyorum. Neden iyi oluyor onu vermek? O çocuk o aşamada cevap veremiyor. Buna yetişkinler de cevap veremiyor gerçi. Birçok kutsal kitaba falan dayandırma dışında pek bir cevap verilme konusunda çok böyle birçok yetişkinden alamayabiliyoruz böyle bir cevabı. Şimdi bir sene geçiyor aradan. Ben felsefi çalışmalarımı çocuklarla sürdürüyorum. Birçok kavram üzerine tartışıyorum. Bir sene sonunda aynı soruyu soruyorum. Ve çocukların bu soruya etik kuramlar üstünden cevap verebildiğini, tartışabildiğini, hatta o dereceye geliyoruz ki işte kategorik imperatifin a priori bir temeli var mıdır yoksa sadece deneyime mi dayandır gibi bir tartışmayı bile 10-11 yaşındaki çocuklarla sene sonunda yapabildiğimi görüyorum. Şimdi bu durumda şöyle bir şey sormak istiyorum size. Evet, ama bunları anlatmadan soruya gelemezdim. Şöyle bir şey sormak istiyorum. Şimdi belli bir kavramsal çerçeve oluştuktan sonra çocukların soyut düşünme yeteneklerinde farklılıklar oluşmaya başlıyor. Ve biz çocukların bugüne kadarki ahlaki eğitimleri için yaptığımız bu deneyler, çocukların soyut düşünmelerine ilişkin deneyler hangi düzeyde yapılıyor acaba? Yani çocuklar ilk elimize alır almaz bu çocukların soyut düşünüp düşünemediğini, felsefi olarak ahlak üzerine düşünüp düşünemediğini kararlaştırabiliyor muyuz? Yoksa belli bir çerçevede eğitimden sonra bunun çok farklılaştığını görüyorum ben. Sizin bu konuda deneyiminiz veya çalışmanız var mı? Örneğin ben hani doktora sonrasında bugüne kadar bununla ilgili bir çalışma yapmadım ama doktora sonrasında bunu çalışmak istiyorum. Sizin böyle bir çalışmanız var mı? Deneyiminizi aktarabilir misiniz bize?
Learnings or understandings than the kind of judgments that children would typically give, like it belongs to him and he should be able to keep it, and if it belonged to me, they would say things like, if it belonged to me, I would want that too, so I don't want to do that to somebody. I wouldn't want it done to me, and I don't want it done to somebody else, is the kind of responses we get.